Architectural collages are a great alternative to a mood board. They allow you to express the kind of idea behind your project, perhaps the mood or the intent, without actually having to draw up a whole 3D model. And we're used to the usual mood board or materials board where you collect together either images or objects that you think are somehow going to be expressive of the project. And the problem with these is they do tend to be kind of flat and rectilinear and basically limited to materials and pictures of furnishings. They're great, and they can be more expressive, and when they are all objects collected in a box, that's really fun to play around with. But let's see if we can do something a little more interesting. So the big thing we're trying to show with this type of drawing is the emotional design intent. And this is kind of like a painting composition exercise. You're really trying to capture a mood or an ambiance, and frequently with a client, it's more important to try and capture that feeling than it is to show them precise materials and furnishings and lightings and architectonic kind of content. And there's a number of things you can express, and these might be things you'd critique a painting for, or a drawing or illustration. Things like whether or not you're indicating intimacy or separation between people, or light and darkness, enclosure or openness. These are all kind of architectural features. Even just smooth and rough, or controlled and chaotic. These are all kind of emotional elements that are part of your design, and particularly early on, you want to see if you can capture that and communicate it to your client. And there's a couple of different styles that I've sort of run across here. Some I think are more geometric, and if you Google or you look at my Pinterest board, you'll see that the geometric abstracts are really quite simple. They're kind of purely expressive, and really very little in there that's realistic. And Zaha Hadid is kind of famous for this feature. And I've got a whole kind of board here that is showing all sorts of different kinds of ideas for this type of image, but down here you'll see there's a Zaha Hadid drawings. They're famously kind of dynamic and interesting to look at, but there's a lot of different options for this type of drawing. And here you see this drawing by Zaha Hadid, or painting, I believe, which is very dynamic and a lot of geometry, and it's sort of vaguely suggestive of architecture, but it's actually really mostly a two-dimensional composition. It's very expressive, emotive, but not necessarily architectural. Same with this drawing, which is, again, from that Pinterest board. You can hunt up the actual artist behind it. It's lovely to look at. Does seem sort of architectural, but kind of not. It's just very expressive and dynamic, and an interplay of shapes and colors and textures. And some are kind of more, to our architectural eyes, what appear to be kind of flat, but again, they tend to be typically much more abstracted. Even something like this, you could say, oh, this is some kind of plan, isn't it? But I think if you examine it closely, it's really a drawing. It's an illustration. It's expressive of something dynamic, something off-axis, but also orthographic, just the orthographic is not aligned always with the paper. So there's something going on there, and it, I think, kind of approaches your emotions more directly than, say, an image of a piece of slate, or a tree or something like that. So some of these drawings can be abstract, but not quite so abstract. I call these perspectival abstracts, and these usually have simple textures and objects like we were seeing before, but they are arranged in perspective. Of course, it does help if you understand perspective when you lay these out. This is a one-point perspective, and you have to use a vanishing point and all sorts of extension lines in order to make this work. But you can see it's quite a convincing drawing, even though it's really just using images of textures kind of overlaid on one another. Here's another drawing. Again, this is super simple to create. You don't need a 3D model for this, and it's quite expressive and interesting. Or even this one, which is quite stark. You could imagine this was drawn using very simple drawing textures and techniques, perhaps a photo manipulation, but super filtered so that it's almost unrecognizable, other than suggesting a covered space that's colonnaded. And even here, again, simple textures, probably repeated over and over again, and a little bit of drawn in shadow, and you've created a space. Again, this is suggestive of, say, an open space with a tall blue thing. What exactly that is, I don't know, but it does have a kind of uplifting feel to it, and there's even a suggestion of a landscape. And this is a nice example where it's pretty much mimicking hand drawing. In fact, it may be hand drawing, and suggestive of a landscape, suggestive of people and a cat, but also some overlaying of different geometric shapes into really what is a super simple space, but it kind of captures this mood, sitting overlooking what looks like some kind of river scene, drafting away at your drafting table. So others that are in this kind of category use architectural elements. You can imagine Googling these different types of images, and they overlay them also in an artistic manner, but you're starting to see suggestions of real things, even if it's echoed things like this guy and then this guy, same guy in silhouette. It kind of starts to be a more spatial object. It starts to represent in our mind something more spatial. Finally, or not finally, but next along, is a photographic pastiche. And this is similar to what we were seeing before, where people use images garnered from the internet, again, trying to capture a sense. And some of these are meant to look literally like a scrapbook. And you can see that they've collected together a number of images, and they've kind of blended them and filtered them here, looking for an overall impact. This one's kind of interesting because it is subtractive. They've taken an image of a forest and kind of cropped it away with some kind of architectural building that they've created. And you can see it creates a really interesting sense of space just by erasing, basically. And this one also using architectural elements. Now we're really starting to use objects in reality that we are representing. However, the scale is kind of a little funky, and of course we're looking up at arches, but also sideways at arches. So there's some definite distortion here, but that's okay. It's still abstracted. You can overlay different elements in or out of perspective, in or out of scale, and that can actually be really interesting so long as the composition itself is strong and dynamic and draws your eye in and across the image. And even something like this, where it's pretty abstract, not sure what they're going for, but you can see it does capture a kind of mood or a sensibility. And you don't always need to see whole images in order to kind of get a feel for a space. So finally, the one that is most amenable to those of us who are kind of concrete linear thinkers is this architectonic pastiche. And this really does combine overt architectural elements and is generally more or less perspectival. Again, it can be totally photographic. In this case, you can see they've probably just used images they've garnered from the internet, but it really creates an architectural space with light and texture and materials. Again, probably all just photoshopped in, but it's quite convincing in how it's put together. Some of these are meant to be really fun, right? We're trying to capture the mood of a space, and a lot of this is just pure texture that they've delineated with flat areas to represent different three-dimensional planes, and quite overtly cut and pasted in plants just to give it that kind of fun look. They didn't bother to make this blended perfectly to make it look like everything was, kind of a photograph. Same with this one, where they've used highly stylized scale figures These can be found on the internet, or you can search for them, or you can create them yourself using filters. And these allow you to have that kind of cut and paste look. That's what pastiche means. Even things like the shadows on the furnishings or the painting on the wall, they're clearly geometricized and faked. But that's the look. It kind of is more of an illustration. And these are quite compelling. You can use very realistic elements, but often they are simple, and by creating it from images rather than developing a 3D model, what you end up with is a more artistic interpretation. This drawing really draws you in with its composition, and it would be an exercise in subtraction if you were to 3D model this and do a full render. But here it's quite easy because we're in Photoshop, a lot more control, and you really can kind of create things that are more challenging when you're 3D modeling, especially these simple conceptual kind of approaches to your project. Early on, these can be quite interesting. And here's some exterior examples. Again, the photographic pastiche is kind of fun. Sure, the perspective's a little bit off. The bus is a little strange in the way it's positioned, and everything is kind of a little bit warped and skewed. But you can see it kind of captures a lively, fun urban park feel, which is kind of the goal, even if it doesn't kind of accurately depict it. And then finally, you're depending on your patience with the software, you can really come up with some lovely looking images. You can see here, it's quite obviously a pastiche. The sky and the background, besides being backwards, CSX is reading backwards, but they've cropped it in an irregular way. They want you to know that this is a collage, but the idea here is to capture a feeling, a sense of, oh, this is a meadow that we've created out of an industrial zone. So quite a lovely way to produce a drawing. And again, most of these elements, I'm sure all of these elements, were just garnered through either their own photographs or, more likely, probably just Google searching different images and image types. So there's a couple of Photoshop techniques that I'm going to go over to help you to create this type of drawing. So let's just jump to Photoshop. So first of all, you'll want to start yourself a brand spanking new file. And I like to go to the print tab here. That just, first of all, it gives you sizes which are recognizable. And of course, we use imperial measurements, so letter size, 8.5 by 11, makes more sense than some of the other measurements, pixels or points or pica. I'm just going to go horizontal. And I usually like to go with a print resolution to start with, just in case I decide I want to print. It's easy to go the other way and make it have lower resolution, but I'm going to go with a full resolution here. But 200 is probably fine for the likes of us, since a lot of the images I'm going to use are simple pattern bases based off of the internet. I won't have such high resolution standards. So click Create to give yourself a blank file. So here's our beautiful blank sheet of paper. And the easiest way to get going is to just draw some simple shapes by pre-selecting the shapes using any of the selection tools. Now, first step is add a new layer here down in the layer dialog box so that you have something to draw on. It's usually good to leave the background layer blank, just it's generally locked. Can be unlocked, but a good policy to leave yourself that layer. And I'll use a marquee tool here. There are a couple. There's an elliptical marquee, a single row, single column, but the rectangular one is fine. And I'll click on that, and when I go to the paint bucket tool, normally it paints the foreground color. So, and you just have to go down here to check this color on the front is the foreground color, and just click inside the box and you'll see that it paints. And if you click outside of the box, because it's not selected, nothing will paint there. Now you can paint with things other than colors. I'm going to make myself a new layer, and I'll give myself another selection area. Maybe I'll go with an elliptical marquee this time. And I can paint an area. And when I use the paint bucket, like I did before, normally paints the foreground color, but I can also paint a pattern. And there's a couple of standard patterns that are loaded into Photoshop by default. You can choose grass or brown grass. Here, let's paint that. And this is a good time to talk about how things paint. Normally, they paint with 100% opacity, which is to say they fully fill the area. There's a certain amount of tolerance, whereas if it finds boundaries, it will stop painting. Anti-aliasing it kind of smooths the lines a little bit. But the other thing to consider is contiguous areas and all layers. If I check all layers, it will look for all layers to find a boundary. But usually in this type of assignment, I'm going to want to fill the whole area and manipulate them afterwards. So I'm going to deselect all layers, but I will select contiguous. That should fill up the whole object. And you can see here, it has painted the color. Now, there aren't very many patterns here in the default library that comes with Photoshop, but let's say you have an image. And I grabbed one off of the internet, which I'm sure you've heard of a piece of terrazzo. Now, I purposely did not look for a seamless piece of terrazzo. Seamless, if you remember from our rendering, will kind of when it tiles on itself, it will look as if there's no boundaries. But I want to show you what it looks like without it, because it's kind of a cool effect sometimes to have those tiling. And what you do is you open up that image that you found on Photoshop. And it doesn't have to be square. It can be rectangular. It just has to have square edges or flat edges. Select everything. Control A will actually select everything. And then just go to the Edit menu, and there's a Define Pattern button. So you choose that, you give it some kind of name, and then you click Create. Now, I've actually already done this, so I'm going to go back to my project here, and that pattern is now going to be available in my project. And I could paint it the way I did before, but I want to show you another way to paint with a pattern, which is using an adjustment layer. And the adjustment layers are found here on the Layers palette, right in the middle. There's a number of different kinds, and what these will do, as long as you have nothing selected, and I have nothing selected, and by the way, Control D deselects whatever you have selected, you can create a whole layer filled with a solid color. I want to create one that is filled with that pattern I just created. So I'll choose Pattern, and what you'll see, first of all, your whole screen gets filled with whatever pattern you've chosen. And I'm going to scroll down, and the one I created should be down here at the bottom. See how it shows up here and it fills the screen. Now, the advantage of using an adjustment layer for this is now I can scale this pattern. And you see how I can make it bigger or smaller, and really small if I want. Let's go with about 12%. I think that looks pretty good. And just click Enter, and you have yourself a pattern. And you might say, well, I don't see any of the other stuff. Remember that layers are opaque in Photoshop, so if I drag this layer down, it will show up beneath the other layers. Now, other types of adjustment layers are also loads of fun. I'll show you now the gradient adjustment layer. And gradients are super fun, mainly because they can kind of lend a little weight to your drawing. And they usually go from the foreground color to the background color. So you see how it's going from red to white here? I'm going to cancel out of that. I'll change my foreground color to black. And now when I go and create an adjustment layer, that's a gradient adjustment layer, it should go from white to black. Now, there are other gradient types, and this is what's kind of cool about gradients, is there are some which go from black to white, foreground to background, but some that go in the opposite direction, or they actually have a transparent color. There's some that are kind of preset ones that have different colors, like blues that might look good in a sky, purples, pinks, oranges, and of course you can customize it. So there's a lot of different ways that you can go about it. There's also non-linear ones. There's radial ones and reflected ones, but I happen to like this one because it lends a little weight to the drawing. I'll click OK, and there you go. There's my layer. I'll turn that on and off to see the effect. Now, layers on their own are opaque to begin with. However, there's a number of different ways that you can mix layers to get different sorts of effects. Now, first of all, the most important one is the opacity. So if I just lower the opacity of a layer, you can see it becomes kind of semi-transparent. And that can be an interesting effect. I'm just going to zoom in here, hold down Alt and zoom in so you can see that a little bit better. But there are other ways to change the way the layers blend without losing quite as much information as changing the opacity. The simplest one is changing what's called the blending mode. Now, normal is the normal way that layers are created, which is to say opaque. If there is a pixel on that layer, you won't be able to see through it. You won't see anything below it. However, multiply has this interesting effect. You can see here, I'll just choose that, how on part of the image, it has, it's basically kind of semi-transparent. Anything that was white in the original image has now become transparent, and anything that's black remains opaque. The opposite of that is actually the screen mode. And the screen mode, anything that was white remains white, but anything that's black becomes transparent. This can really create some interesting effects on your different layers. And even solid colors can have these same blending modes. If I go to the red color layer, and let's just say I go with the multiply layer, you can see how now it is become kind of semi-transparent, and what's going on, you say, well, there's no black or white in that menu. It's kind of taking an average pixel value. I believe it goes on the RGB value. So you can really create some interesting textures just by kind of drawing individual pieces and then overlaying them. The other thing is that some of these other layers, for example, the gradient fill, that's a little dark for my tastes. So I could try using multiply. I could also try some of these others. Now, some of them may just kind of soften the effect. You see how this is making it just a little bit darker. Each of these is going to behave a little differently depending on the colors underneath and on top of the image. So sometimes it just takes a little experimentation. You can also just lower the opacity if that makes it look better. But these blending modes, especially with colors, can really give you some interesting textural options just by changing the size and scale of the images. Now, sometimes you want to remove part of an area of color. For example, this background is a bit much. And if I want to remove part of it, well, I could just use the eraser tool, and there's all sorts of different sizes for the brushes, and I could manipulate that. However, a much easier and non-destructive way is to take advantage of a layer mask. And what that does, if you look down here on our layers for gradient fill and pattern fill, there's a little white box. When I click on it, the tooltip should pop up sooner or later that says it's the layer mask thumbnail. And that mask, well, normally white allows all of the pattern to pass through. If you were to paint a part of that area black, and I'm just going to select a rectangular area, and I'm going to use the paint bucket. Remember, my foreground color is set to black, and I am highlighting this area of the layer mask. Now when I paint it, you see how it has basically eliminated that section of the layer mask. Do Control-D to deselect so you can see what it looks like. To show you what it looks like if I were to draw it, I'll come over here and I'll use the paintbrush. And the paintbrush, it's set pretty big right now. I'm going to use my left bracket to reduce it. And maybe I'll hold down Shift to get a nice even line. Now when I drag across this background layer, you can see that it's only removing part of it. And by the way, if I hold down Shift and I keep clicking from end to end, it will go over and over that area. But it's a little softer because it's a brush. It's also not 100% opaque. It's only 37% opaque. So as I use that, it's a way that you can, say, remove large areas of the background without actually erasing it. If I were to select all this and paint it white again, all that color would come back. So it's a kind of a non-destructive way of eliminating parts of your drawing. And what's cool about layer masks, once you're done editing it, you do have to click back on the main color. But let's say I want to create a new layer with some green in it. If I say pre-selected an area, and I'll just do a rectangle, and maybe I'll add on a little ellipse onto either side by holding down Shift so that I get a funny shape. And you see how it has created kind of a shape with some horns on it. Now, when I go and I create a solid color adjustment layer, it has pre-selected that area. It's actually created the layer mask already. And now I can just pick a different color. Here, let's add some green. And OK. And like before, it is going to jump right into the layer. And if there are any other blending modes in operation, you can see how it already respects that. And these layer masks can be added to other layers. If you click on the layer, there is a little icon here that's Add Layer Mask. And then, like magic, you have a little mask, and you can do the same trick that we did before. Draw a shape and paint it black, or use any of your drawing tools to create openings, holes, and whatnot. Just don't forget to click back on the main color so that you can get out of layer mask editing mode. If you just want to draw some lines on your project, give yourself a new layer. And I've got a layer here. I'll drag it up to the top of my list. And there are two basic drawing tools here. There's the pencil tool, which is for drawing kind of sharper lines, typically, and the brush tool, which is typically for drawing softer lines, although each basically can be adjusted. You can click and drag to draw. You can also click, and then while holding down Shift, you can draw straight lines by just clicking from one endpoint onto the other. One thing to notice, if you use this smoothing tool, I'll drag this smoothing tool all the way up to the top. When you click and drag, there's a lot of delay. See how my cursor is way ahead of the line? And that tends to make the lines a little, well, you guessed it, smoother. They're drawing at 100% opacity, and they're drawing the foreground color. I don't particularly like these lines, but we'll just hit undo to get rid of them. The other thing is, if you tap the left bracket, the line will get bigger. If you tap the right bracket, it will get smaller. Clicking on the brush tool, typically the brush tool does not draw initially at 100% opacity, so you're going to get a softer line. See how it's not full? But the same options apply. You can click and drag, and you get a smoothed line, depending on your smooth settings. And then you can also hold down Shift and get lines drawing on top of each other. The interesting thing about using the brush, because it's not 100% opaque, you get kind of an additive effect. So you can actually come up with some pretty fun patterns by using that tool. One other way to draw lines that are kind of interesting and different is you activate whichever command you want, pen or pencil. I'm going to go with the pencil. But click on the brush settings menu. And there you'll see that there's actually a lot of different brushes in the kind of palette. Not as many as Adobe Illustrator, which really does have quite a lot. But you can actually get some interesting effects with some of these. When you click and drag it, this is what the line will look like, which may or may not be, as exciting for you. But let me make myself a new layer here, and you can actually get some really interesting effects by making these really big sometimes. Here, we'll give it a slightly different color so you can kind of see it. And, except I sampled that color by mistake. And sometimes you can get these like interesting effects just by clicking and sort of dabbing it. And then maybe dropping the opacity down or changing the blending mode. Sometimes that gives it a little interesting effect, or sometimes not. Also, again, with some of these, as you go, they're not going to be quite as like hand-drawn as some of the ones that you can get in Adobe Illustrator, but you can absolutely get some interesting looking line types just depending on the tool that you choose and whether you click and drag it or just kind of dot it. But the last way to draw lines, here, let me get rid of that layer and make myself a new one, is to draw a preset pattern just by using any of the selection tools. I'm going to draw this just a random shape here. And it's not quite as good, again, as like a perspective drawing tool, but I can draw the shape, and if I go to the Edit menu, I can choose Stroke. And what this will do is, based on my settings here, say 5 pixels, and let's make it black just so we can see it. And I can just choose the location of the line on that stroke. And again, kind of like Illustrator, except that the stroke doesn't remain. And I'll click OK, and now it has added in the lines here. Let's do that again. I'll make it a little bit darker so that it's a little easier to see. So Edit, Stroke, and let's make it 15 pixels so we can see a little bit better. There we go. Nice dark line. So that's a way that you can kind of experiment with getting the line exactly as you want it. Of course, you can always use Illustrator if you really want to do a lot of drawing, but this is a nice way to get some nice lines in your project. And by the way, while you have that, I'm going to reselect that area. Let's say you want to add some color fill to that. I'll give myself a new layer, and maybe I'll draw in some fill. If you just go to the Edit menu and choose Fill, that same selected area, we could, say, fill that with material. I'll just choose this pattern. And if I drag it below the other layer, you can see you can get quite a nice little outline. So having those selection areas is awfully handy, and you can kind of crop down images quite nicely. There are some nice and simple layer effects that you can add. For example, a drop shadow might be nice on this shape here. However, I can't really add it when they're two separate layers like this. It doesn't always work so well. What I can do, I can select multiple layers and just merge them. Just right-click on them and choose Merge Layers. Don't choose Merge Visible, because that will basically merge everything together. Just the two that I have selected. So now they're just one layer. It makes it easy to turn them on and off. But it also allows me to go to the Layer menu, and under Layer Style, there's a number of different options that I can choose. Some of these we've seen, but Drop Shadow is the one that is kind of the most fun to play with. I'll just put this menu up here so we can kind of see the shadow. And there's any number of options here, including the direction of the shadow, or I guess the direction of the sun, and you can make it bigger or smaller to kind of create an effect that you like. And you can even apply drop shadows to these adjustment layers. Just select layer and choose layer style, drop shadow, and any of these other options here. So with these basic techniques for creating areas of color and layering and layer blending techniques, you can probably create most of these sort of geometric collage type of drawings that we were talking about. However, what if you want to do something more perspectival? Well, there are a few different ways you can go about that. So perspective grids are super helpful for drawing in, yes, you guessed it, perspective. And I'm going to assume you understand what a horizon line and a vanishing point or vanishing points is or are. In Photoshop, you can create a simple non-snapping grid, a grid where you'll basically have to align your objects to the grid by eye. There are grids and guides that you can use for aligning vertical lines, or in a one-point perspective, the horizontal lines. But mostly you're going to be doing this by eye, and you just basically create a shape in Photoshop, a polygon, and it ends up looking kind of like a star. In this case, I recommend 50 sides with no fill and a 1% what's called a star ratio. And then you can just move that around. You can stretch it and have it be a 1 point, or if you have two of them, a 2 point. Super easy. Adobe Illustrator is a more advanced program for drawing in perspective, and I would also like to note that there are iPad apps for both Photoshop and Illustrator that allow the use of the stylus, the pencil, Apple Pencil, and of course you can always use a sketching program like Morpholio Trace that will export to Photoshop and is also handy. And that has a very robust perspective grid as well. Anyway, in Illustrator, you can turn on a perspective grid and edit it to make it look like an exterior or an interior, 1 point or 2 point. It even also has a 3-point perspective. And you can just choose which face you want to draw on. And this is really great for drawing outlines on a perspective grid, even if it's just as a reference. Some of us are more or less trusty in our ability to draw in perspective. So having that grid is super handy. Bummer about Illustrator is that it's really quite difficult to use images and warp them to fit the perspective. So you can bring the Illustrator file back into Photoshop, and it works just great. So I'll show you both of those. So in Photoshop, I have a nice blank drawing, and I'm going to draw my horizon line using the line tool. And if you don't see the line tool, it's hidden under one of these other shape tools. And I'm just going to draw it as this object because it's easy to manipulate. Also, if you hold down Shift, you see how it locks the position. And what's nice is it does actually have grips, so I can change it later on, and I can modify the pixel value to make it thicker or thinner. Here, let's go with a little bigger size, so it's easy to see. And but nice is I can manipulate it afterwards. Of course, it's its own layer when you create a polygon, so it makes it easy to move around. And then to create the perspective grid, use one of these other shape tools, the Polygon tool. And what you'll see up here, again, there are options for how this object is going to be created. No fill, using a stroke that's a solid stroke. You can pick a color. I'll pick, I don't know, blue. And but then choosing the number of sides here. This is it's I don't know, a polygon icon with a number in the middle. 50 sides is good. When you click on the screen, it will pop up the menu for the creating polygon, and you can choose change how many sides. But the other thing is the star ratio, and this is kind of, I don't know how much it's extruded towards the center, I guess. And make sure you have it set to go from the center. Just click OK, and it will create a little star. I guess 100 pixels was a little small. You can stretch it, but like most manipulations here in Photoshop, don't forget to hold down Shift so that the stretching is proportional. You don't want to have it get all warped, because that wouldn't make a very good polygon. And now you can just move that, and if this is a 1-point perspective, I can just put this right in the middle of my screen. I'm going to hold down Alt and make sure that I get this in the right size here. There we go. Okay, and now you have a 1-point grid that you can copy. Just click the checkbox. And if you want 2 of these, you can actually just duplicate the layer. Choose Duplicate Layer, and call it Polygon Copy 2. And now the copy, I can move over to one side. I'll click on the other layer to select it. And by the way, sometimes when you have these very large objects, sometimes Photoshop will automatically auto-select the layer below, if you check this. And that can make it a little tricky sometimes to select and move objects. So I'm going to unselect, auto-select, in order to make it easier to move. So how do you actually draw with this perspective grid we've set up? Well, here I've got my 1 point all set up. And by the way, I grouped these. They're in a handy-dandy group so that I can turn on the 1 or the 2-point perspectives for the demonstration. And I can also dim the entire group, but just by lowering the opacity. Now, to draw in a 1 point, it's quite simple. You just start drawing and use the grid as reference. Now, for a 1-point perspective, we know that the background is the picture plane, and that is a rectangle. And now we can just use any of the tools that we have discussed for drawing objects. We can either draw a rectangle with a solid color, or we can select a rectangular region and fill it with some area, edit, fill, and fill it with some pattern if we want, or we could even fill it with a solid color. If we want to create an object that is following the perspective grid, one of the easiest ways is to do just what we did, come and use a polygonal lasso to follow this grid and say I'm going to draw a wall here. I'm just following the grid and try to estimate where it is underneath this line. Now I could eye this, but you can see I'm pretty far off. So much better is I have my my rulers on here, and I can just drag a reference line in from the side. So it gives me a little blue reference line. And you can actually turn on all sorts of grids and guides under the View menu. You can show the grid, you can show guides, which is what I have visible right now. And these are really handy for being able to snap to something, or at least have a reference line. So now let's go and I'll use my reference line that I just drew, my guideline, and now it's a lot easier. And you can see I'm just kind of estimating where does this line go in the perspective grid, just like you would do if you were drawing by hand. The advantage here is that it does snap to that guideline quite nicely, and then we can fill it, or we could paint it with a color or something like that. So very simple and straightforward. Now, what if I have an image that I want to use? And of course, image processing is what Photoshop is all about. And I just placed this image in here that I got off of who knows where, the good old internet, just a facade. And I want to make it look like it's in perspective. Well, I can drag it over, I can stretch it, and in Photoshop, if you hold down Shift, it will stretch it unproportionately, I guess you could say. Click check. In Photoshop, there is a special tool called a transform tool, and this will allow you to manipulate the edges of this object. So right now, when I transform this, you can see it warps it, but it only warps it either vertically or horizontally. Let me accept that change. Under the Edit pull-down menu, there's a bunch of other transform tools. And the one that is usually the most effective is either Perspective or Distort. And I'll show you Perspective. If you grab one end, it will actually stretch it. Now this works really well if your horizon line is kind of right in the middle of the 1-point perspective, but you see how my horizon line is slightly off, so this bottom is slightly off. What I can do is if I go to Edit, Transform, Distort, what this will do is it'll allow me to actually grab individual points, and now I can kind of stretch it so that it matches the perspective a little bit better. I'm off a little bit, and of course I probably should have dragged in another reference line, and that'll make my life a lot easier, but basically this is the process for getting objects to look like they're in perspective. You can do that with any object on the ground, on the wall. Just use the Distort tool to get the result that you want. Now, manipulating images is one thing, but what if you have one of those patterns we created, say the terrazzo, and we want it to look like that's in perspective? Well, it gets a little more tricky. Let's create a blank layer here or an adjustment layer with that pattern on it. So I'll go to my Adjustment Layers menu, choose Pattern. We will choose the terrazzo, and let's make it a smaller scale so that we can make it look kind of about the right size in the project. So, okay. And I'm going to zoom out. You see I have a whole layer filled with this terrazzo. And what we can do is you can't warp it as is when it's a pattern. However, we can right-click on it and choose Rasterize Layer. And Rasterize Layer converts it to basically just a picture. And once it's a picture, well, we know how to do that. I'm just going to drag it down in the list here so that it's below my perspective. And actually, let me drag my perspective elements up so that I can see those. And now I'll go to my pattern fill layer, and I can just use my transform tools to transform it to look like it's in perspective. So here we are in Illustrator, and I've started a new blank document. It's 8.5 by 11, just like my other document in Photoshop. And it is handy if they match, so it's a good idea. And if you want to see the perspective grid, it's quite simple. You just go to the View menu and choose Perspective Grid, Show Grid. And there it is. And you might say, well, what if I don't want a 2-point perspective? You can go to that same view menu under Perspective Grid, and there's also 1 points and 3 points. Okay, and let's go to the 2-point perspective just because it's a lot more cool. And what you'll see here, it's an orange plane, a blue plane, kind of greenish ground plane, 2 vanishing points, and this little widget up here which allows you to choose the side that you're going to draw on. And if you want to call up all the controls, allow you to manipulate the plane and that you draw on, and also the vanishing points, just type Shift-P. Or if you're using the classic workspace, there's actually a button that looks like a perspective. But anyway, what you'll see here are little grips that you can adjust the perspective view. The height of it, you can move the vanishing points in or out just by dragging them, so you can make it an asymmetrical perspective. And you can move these planes. Right now it's as if we were looking at the front of a building, but you can move them back and have it appear as if you're looking at the back of a building. So there's any number of different adjustments that you can make to get the plane to look kind of just the way you are thinking. And of course, we're designing, right? So we don't necessarily always know in advance what we want the perspective grid to look like. And you should be able to, let's go back to Shift-P. You should be able to move the entire grid over a little bit just by grabbing some of these lines here. I forget which one. And you can, of course, change the height of the horizon line, which is super helpful. You can also give yourself a little bit more ground space at the bottom by dragging the bottom grip, I think. And so once you've got the grid set the way you want, now you can start drawing. And how do you pick which plane that you're drawing on? Well, while you're in this editing mode here, the grid editing mode, you can see the highlighted surface. The color matches the surface that you're drawing on. So let's say I want to just draw, I'll just draw with a rectangle here. I can draw a rectangle, on this wall, click and drag to draw. Here's one surface, and I'll click on drag on this wall and draw another rectangle. And you can see how that, that makes a pretty compelling perspective quite simply. And finally, we can draw on the ground here. We'll draw another rectangle because we're all about drawing rectangles. And obviously, I've gone off the grid here so much, so to speak, but you can draw smaller objects as well. So this is quite handy, and you can see that I could because this is Illustrator, I could fill these areas, or I could just use them as reference. For example, if I wanted, say, I don't know, a guardrail effect, I could pick the blue plane. That's the orange plane. And draw a rectangle starting here, and it will draw it into the foreground. And maybe I'll have a guardrail on the opposite side, and we'll start it here in the same spot so they kind of line up. And you can see that, is it perfect? Absolutely not. But it definitely gives you a reference that you can use in Photoshop for stretching images or even just painting and filling areas. So save your document, and then we'll head back to Photoshop. So here in my blank Photoshop document, I'm going to place the file that I created, place embedded, and I have a whole folder with stuff I've collected for this project. And here's my perspective line work. I'm going to place that into the document, and it usually gives you a preview of the area that's going to get placed. Click OK, and there it is. And you can see it has cropped the image based on the edge of my artboard in Illustrator. But this is the basic image, and I can manipulate it slightly. There's not a huge amount that you can do, actually, to the original file, other than open it up and re-edit it, and then it will update here in Photoshop. But the beauty of working within the happy Adobe family is that everything behaves more or less as it should. So for example, if I want to paint this back wall, I can use the magic wand tool, and of course I have to be on the correct layer, and I can just sample all layers, and I'm going to go with contiguous and see how it selects that whole area. Hold down Shift to add in that little last piece, and then I can paint it in any which way that I want. We'll just paint it with some beautiful grass. So it behaves as it should. If I want to go back and change the line weights or even the brushes and the strokes, all I have to do is go back to that original Illustrator file. To do that, you can just right-click on the layer, that is the Illustrator layer, and there should be an option for Edit Contents, and that should open it up into Illustrator. And so if you had it open already, then you could just go to it in Illustrator. But now, for example, if I wanted to change all the lines to a different brush stroke, and here I've used Control-A to select all the paths, and I could choose a hand-drawn look here, or you could even go to the library, and let's look for some fun brushes here. There's all sorts of good ones in Illustrator. You can make it look any number of different ways. And anyway, when you do that and you click OK and save and close Illustrator, it should bring you back to your Photoshop document. And you can see here it updated. It took a minute or so for it to do its job and update. You can always close Photoshop and open it back up again, and you'll get a different object. But so this is a way you can work together and get with the two programs and get a lot more interesting line weights and a lot more kind of brush options. There's a lot of different cool brushes in Illustrator. If you like that kind of sketchy look, or there's certainly other types of lines besides sketchy. So those are pretty much the skills that you need for generating the geometric type of perspective. With some overlaying and some texturing, like we learned in the first part, you can create a pretty nice geometric perspective. To make it more photographic, to add photographic elements to it, well, then you need to do a couple things. First of all, you need to find photographs that are going to fit into this view, and then you need to put them in the correct perspective. And I'm not here to advertise for Bing, but I will say that it does make it easier to get images of the size that you want. You can just go to the image search here on Bing and choose large or even extra large, and you'll get images that are of a higher quality. And for example, I just searched for people with a transparent background, but of course you can always search for other things, pieces of furniture. You can choose white background, or PNG is often a good one to look for. And then when you find the image, don't just click on it, but actually click on it to click through. See how it shows me the preview image here. And this checkerboard does indicate a transparent background, but go to the original image, choose View Image, and that should take you to the highest resolution that you're going to get. And you should be able to just right-click on it and copy the image, assuming it's the correct format. And then back here in Photoshop, in theory, I can just paste it right in. Control-V to paste, and like magic, nothing happens. Oh, there he is. Now, if there is a black background, you can get rid of it right here in Photoshop by using the Magic Wand tool sometimes. Now, the Magic Wand tool, it does look for adjacent colors to determine the edges. Now, this is a particularly tricky image, which I chose. Whoops, and we don't want to sample all layers. We just want to sample this layer. Sometimes it will get it. You see how it's sort of missed a little piece of this? We can drop the tolerance down to basically 1 and see if it gets the edge. And actually, it did a pretty good job there. And I can hit Delete, and away goes the background. Control-D to deselect, and there's my guy. And by the way, in images which just will not allow you to select them out, you can save them and open them as a separate file. Saving them often seems to preserve the PNG transparent background. On Mac computers, they don't seem to have this problem. I'm not sure why. Anyway, the problem now is how do we make this guy the size that we want? Let me select this layer here, and I can move my guy around. I have my little transform tools. How do I make him the right size? Well, this is where our perspective grid comes in handy. And the trick here is, which we have seen before, is to put his feet wherever you think his feet should be standing in the space, and then just stretch the image so that it is the height. The head or the shoulders is at the height you want. Now, the head or shoulders should be where the camera height is. So if we're assuming this is a room-sized drawing, then probably it's about the shoulders. And there we go. I have him the right size. If I want to make him a different size, say standing in the foreground, I can actually just stretch him right out. And I'll not hold down Shift so it doesn't distort. And I can move this guy over. And as long as the shoulders are more or less in the same position, it should look like he's standing in the foreground. What if I have some sort of object that I want to include? And this is very common where you find something, a light fixture, or in this case, a lovely counter, that I want to include, but I don't feel like drawing it, and I could try to use selection tools, lassos, and maybe the magic wand here. There's the magic wand tool to try to get the edges of the counter. Whoops, I'm on the wrong layer. And the magic wand sometimes will work good, but it's quite tedious. However, there are a couple of other tools that you can use. The quick selection or the object selection tool often works really well. Quick selection, you kind of paint over an object and it kind of guesses what you want. And that usually works pretty well. But then the object selection tool, it uses artificial intelligence to guess what you want. And you see how I just click on this object and it's got the whole thing. And that often works really well. And you can use these tools in conjunction with each other. So for example, if I want to get the rest of this counter, but maybe these jars, I can kind of click on different objects and get the whole kit and caboodle pretty quickly and save myself a lot of misery. Now, I could, of course, clean this up. This is where modifiers become really handy. If you hold down Shift, you might be able to see on my cursor there's a teeny tiny little plus sign. And if I hold down Control, or Alt, I'm sorry, Alt gives me a negative sign. So, for instance, I kind of selected a little bit too much here, and I can use Alt to kind of remove that from the selection, kind of clean it up a little bit. And then I can go back, again, not changing my tool. Holding down Shift, I can continue to add in little bits and pieces here and there. And you can zoom in, obviously, and make your selection a lot more precise, and get a really nice looking selection tool. Now, I could do one of two things. I could basically copy and paste this counter in, Control-C, Control-V, and now I have myself a new layer with just the counter. Alternatively, another method is whoops, wrong one. When I have the whole counter in there, let me reselect my area here. I can actually right-click on it, choose Select Inverse, and then delete that. And either way, you end up with a kind of background where you have just the counter. And now to get the counter in the correct perspective, you just use your vanishing points. It is pretty clear from the image, the original image, that this is below the horizon line because we are seeing the top of the counter. And if I want this to go, say, in the back of the room, I just make it small enough so that it fits in the back of the room. And then I change the layer organization so that it goes below our gentlemen here who are still reading their paper. And there you go. You've got yourself a countertop that more or less looks like it's in perspective. Now, as you put the finishing touches on some of these imported objects, sometimes they're missing little bits and pieces. For example, down here at the bottom of the counter, that was not included in the original picture. It was just cropped off. But we can make Photoshop kind of guess what goes in there. It has this cool feature This simplest way is in the Fill menu, but there's a whole separate menu that will also work. I'll use the short version for now, which is in the Fill menu, instead of choosing a color or a pattern, you can choose what's called Content Aware. And it's kind of study what's on this layer and guess as to what it should be. And you can see here, it does a pretty good job of filling in the area. Using the whole content-aware menu can actually get you some more sophistication, but for our purposes, this is a great way to kind of fill in missing elements of projects, or heal parts of walls where perhaps there's a light post or something like that in the way. One last stylistic flourish that you can add is using filters to create interesting effects on your images. So for example, if I wanted to modify the way that these guys look and kind of soften it or make it look, I don't know, more stylized, if you go to the filter menu, there's a whole bunch of different filters, and many of these we have seen in our other exercise where we, which is in a separate video on the Photoshop Charrette, where we learned all sorts of fun blurring techniques and other things. But here you can make things look kind of, oh, I don't know, a little more stylistic. And you can see here in the preview, this is just applying to this one image, and we can really tweak this, the longer or shorter, the stroke length, the different look that you're going to get. It just is a kind of a matter of preference. So you can see that you can apply it to just one image or one layer, and sometimes that's an interesting effect. Especially if you want to, I don't know, lower the amount that something seems to be realistic. You sometimes don't want people to be quite as distracting. That's kind of a nice way to, I don't know, blur them out or make them less distracting in your view. In order to make a filter work on the entire image, you do need to flatten the image. Now, I am very reticent to go and there is an option to just flatten the whole kit and caboodle. And the reason is because it gets rid of all your layers and, you know, then you can't go backwards. So a little trick is you can save a copy of your project, and mine's called 1-point collage, but you save it in a file format which is flat. And I'm going to choose JPEG just because it's a nice small format. And this, again, this is going to be a copy, so it won't affect the original drawing. Click OK. And then you can open up that file. And you can see here it has preserved all sorts of features of that image. And it just has one layer, the background layer. And I can double click on that background layer and turn it into an editable layer. Normally they're locked. And now I can filter to my heart's delight and just go to the filter gallery. And now we can affect the entire image. And sometimes that has the effect of I don't know, blurring everything just enough or blending everything that it does seem like a single composition. You can see here, this just kind of softens the image a lot. Enough that it looks like everything is blurred together. Also, I have left on, by accident, the perspective lines, but you can see that actually there is something to leaving those on. I don't know if everybody likes that look, but it does have a kind of very, I don't know, architectural look. Adds a little bit more information, and again, makes it look more like a collage-y kind of diagram than carefully composed, realistic perspective. So these techniques, along with some of the ones you learned last year in our perspective exercise, perspective charrette in Photoshop, these should allow you to create a perspective collage for your projects that make a statement about what the experience and the emotive impact is going to be without having to do a full photorealistic 3D model that's rendered and all that kind of stuff.